So with this next lecture, I'm going to be breaking it up into smaller sections because it's such a long lecture. This part of it, we're going to talk about basic cell structure, different types of cells, what the cell theory is and what it says, and we may even get a little bit into things that are living and things that aren't living. So sit back, buckle your seatbelts, and off we go. Okay, so I promised to talk a little bit about the fact that viruses aren't really considered living, and part of the reason for this is because of cell theory, which is a group of ideas that have been tested widely, and they were hypotheses. They've been tested widely. They've been supported over and over again, and by many different researchers. And this is what people have found: all living organisms are composed of at least one or more similar cells. That all of the chemical reactions of that organism have to take place inside the cells. Remember, that isn't the same with viruses, because viruses need another cell for their reactions to take place. It also says that cells arise from other cells. They don't just poof into existence. And that they have hereditary information that's passed on from the parent cell to the offspring cell. So there's similarity between the original cell and the offspring cell. And it may be that they're even identical depending on the type of cell and what the cell is doing, or they may be slightly different, just depends on what kind of organism we're talking here. So that's the cell theory. Now, I've talked about viruses, we talked about cells, but there are two major categories, different types of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Now, both of these cells, no matter what kind of cell it is, it has an outer membrane that people will call sometimes a plasma membrane, sometimes a cellular membrane, that they share in common, but the two types are very distinct in a lot of different ways. And in fact, the prokaryotes are even distinct in other ways. There's actually two categories of them that really wasn't discovered until very recently, because the difference is in their DNA. So it's not something that's visibly observable, but it's something that we can sequence, we can look at the DNA, and there's some major differences in prokaryotes, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, one thing that you can see from this picture of prokaryotes and eukaryotes is that prokaryotes, the ones that are up in the upper left-hand corner, are much smaller than eukaryotes. In fact, if you look at them under a microscope that we could look at in our lab, you would hardly be able to see the prokaryote, whereas the eukaryote, you'd be able to see structures and all sorts of really interesting things in it. So that's one thing you can see. Another thing, if you notice, is the prokaryotes look pretty simple. There's not a whole lot of things inside of them. The eukaryotes, however, have all sorts of little bubbly-like structures in there. There's a great big round purple thing in the middle. They're just a lot more complex and organized than prokaryotic cells. And there are reasons for this that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Okay, so here's a picture of just a generalized prokaryotic cell. The genetic material is in a circular chromosome, so it's just a circle. It's still the double helix. This DNA is naked. In other words, there's no proteins, there's no anything else. It's just straight DNA inside of those things. There's no nucleus, which is actually the name of the cell, is pronucleus. Pro is before and karyote is nucleus, so there's no nucleus present. There's no organelles. In other words, there's no little structures that do specific things like your organs. Again, they're considerably smaller than eukaryotes, and some examples include things that make us sick, like strep, meningitis, and then things that aren't so bad for us, like E. coli. They live inside our intestines and actually help us make vitamin K. And without it, we actually feel kind of ill, and that's one of the reasons actually why antibiotics can make you feel kind of sick and nasty, is because you're actually killing off some of the good prokaryotes, the good bacteria that are living inside of you. Now these are some examples of prokaryotes. Like I said before, prokaryotes are actually broken into two different categories of organisms, and if you looked at them under the microscope, they would look pretty much identical. There's no structural differences in these, but their DNA is very, very different. The archaea, or they used to call it archaebacteria, are prokaryotes that actually live in some really crazy areas. They have heat-loving archaea that live in these boiling pools in Yellowstone, or actually in the geysers, or they live down deep, deep, deep in the ocean in the vents that bubble up magma from the center of the earth. The ones below it, the halobacters, love salt. I mean, salty, 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 so salty everything else dies except for that particular bacteria. So the archaea are very interesting. If you look at them genetically, they actually are a little bit more like eukaryotic organisms like you and me than like the bacteria that make you sick when you get a bacterial infection like pink eye. Now on the other side, the bacteria, on the top we have E. coli. Like I said, if they're in the right place, they're good. They actually make vitamin K for you. They're in your intestines. They help you break down some of the food that's really hard for you to break down. But if they get out of your intestines, everybody knows you can actually get sick from these if it gets out of the cow's intestines and gets into the meat, because it will actually make you very, very sick if you don't cook it enough. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, you can see Helicobacter pylori. In the past, they thought that that stomach ulcers were actually caused by stress. And just recently they found that there is actually a bacteria that is associated with people getting stomach ulcers, and it's this H. pylori that does it. So there's lots of stuff, like I said, about the microbiomes, the organisms that live in you, under you, on you, with you, that can help you and can hinder you just based on what's going on with your body. Okay, now eukaryotes are probably everything that you would come up with if I asked you to come up with living organisms. You are made up of eukaryotic cells, plants are made up of eukaryotic cells, dogs are made up of eukaryotic cells, fleas are made up of eukaryotic cells, and they all share some common things, some common characteristics. First, their genetic material is different than the prokaryotes. It's in a linear chromosome, so it's in a line, it's not in a circle. And it's got all these proteins all over the DNA that helps them compact down. Eukaryotes have a lot more DNA than prokaryotes. So they need to be able to pack a lot of information in a small space. They also, this DNA that we were just talking about, is contained in something called a nucleus, which protects the DNA and stores it in a very special place so that all of the other functions of the cells don't get in the way. The eukaryotic cell also has things called organelles that sequester functions for the cell. So there are, for example, the mitochondria that helps the cell make its energy. There are ribosomes that help the cell make proteins. There are places to package things so that it happens in very specific locations. I like to say that eukaryotes are kind of like having a roomed house, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, maybe even more. Whereas prokaryotes are like a studio apartment where everything is open and the only thing that you might be able to close off is the bathroom. Anyway, those are some differences and those are some similarities between all eukaryotic organisms. Okay, so now for some examples of eukaryotic cells. See those crazy little purple things in the upper left-hand corner? Those are called trypanosomes, and remember the little silly fuzzy thing that I showed you earlier? They cause sleeping sickness and Shangus disease in humans. If a mosquito or some kind of crazy fly bites you and is infected with this eukaryote, it can cause some major nasty symptoms in humans. And likewise, the little red blood cells are also eukaryotes. Crazily enough, they're eukaryotes without a nucleus, but that's only when they are at maturity, so that's kind of those crazy Jeopardy examples. They do have a nucleus when they are younger. The eukaryote next to that is the eukaryote that causes red tide. It's a dinoflagellate. It's got a nucleus, but it acts kind of like an algae. It is an algae that if you over-fertilize, if you've ever been to the ocean in the summertime when we're having a red tide outbreak, it's nasty. It can cause respiratory problems because they have toxins that they carry, and when the waves crash, it breaks and it gets into the air. It causes fish to die, so it's also stinky all over the beach, and that's a eukaryote. Our human nerve cells, which you can see on the far right-hand side, are also eukaryotes, because we are eukaryotes. Diatoms, those pretty little things down on the left-hand side, which are actually they had been used for toothpaste. I don't think they use them anymore that way. But they also use them for cleaning silica, like computer chips. They're made out of silica, and they're just pretty little eukaryotic organisms that live in the oceans and fresh water as well. And then here's a nasty one that I always kind of like to talk about. This one's called Naegleria fowleri. And if you've ever heard of the amoeba that crawls up your nose and can kill you if you're swimming in fresh water, this is the one that does it. It really doesn't kill that many people each year, maybe a handful per year, but it's common in Florida and Texas and any place where you've got kind of warm ponds. It can grow on the bottom, and if it gets up your nose, which usually it requires something like maybe water skiing or diving in and getting it up your nose, then it can, by the time you feel the symptoms, they can't do anything for you. So it's very, very deadly and unpleasant, but a eukaryote nonetheless. So here's something else that I tend to try to do at the end of my lectures or kind of in between sections, is to give you some questions to think about, some questions to consider. And you probably would want to answer some of these. You might see them on some quizzes, you might see them on some exams. So think about, what are the two different types of cells? You should be able to answer that. Some of the major differences and some of the reasons for these differences. What do the cells do? How are they different? Are they single cell? Are they multi-celled, most of them? Do they live a long time or a short time? Check into it, and we will talk about it on Tuesday.